Daniel always believed that the best parts of life were the ones tucked away from noise and constant oversight. When he purchased his new property on the edge of a quiet lake, he saw more than just a house and a backyard. To him, it was a place of freedom, a private sanctuary where he could breathe without interruption. Unlike most of the homes in the development, his property lines stretched all the way down to the water's edge. The lake glistened under the sun, still and undisturbed, as though waiting for someone to truly appreciate it. Daniel loved the idea of camping, not in some crowded campground hours away, but right on his own land. On his very first weekend after settling in, he pitched a modest green tent near the shoreline. He gathered a small circle of stones to make a fire pit and sat under the open sky as dusk fell, listening to the rustle of leaves and the soft ripple of the water. It was the kind of peace he had always imagined when he dreamed of owning property. The neighbors noticed almost immediately. A few of them waved politely from a distance, while others whispered with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. In their eyes, camping was something reserved for the woods, not their manicured neighborhood. Still, Daniel wasn't hurting anyone. He cleaned up after himself, kept his fires contained, and even collected stray trash that drifted onto the shore from time to time. For him, camping by the lake was not only about relaxation, but also about reconnecting with the land he now called his own. As the days went by, word traveled to the association board. The president had a reputation for keeping a sharp eye on everything within the development. To her, every detail mattered: the shade of paint on mailboxes, the height of fences, and the number of flowers in front yards. She saw herself as the guardian of order, and when she learned that Daniel was camping on his property, she decided it was something that could not be ignored. From his perspective, the lake had always been shared space. Over the years, residents treated it as a communal feature, walking their dogs along the water, taking photos, or simply enjoying the view. What many never realized, however, was that the legal boundary of Daniel's property included the portion of land stretching into the water itself. This fact did not matter. Tradition mattered more, and she was determined to keep it that way. One quiet morning, Daniel awoke to the sound of footsteps crunching along the trail behind his tent. He unzipped the flap and spotted two board members standing near the shore, snapping pictures on their phones. When he stepped out to greet them, they waved but did not smile. Instead, they asked pointedly what he was doing and whether he had permission to camp there. Daniel remained calm. "This is my land," he explained. "I'm just enjoying it." The board members exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat and said, "We'll need to report this. It may not be allowed." Daniel didn't argue. He had already reviewed the association handbook when he moved in, and there was nothing that prohibited camping, especially not on private property. He watched them leave, shaking his head at how something so simple could be seen as disruptive. That night, as Daniel sat by the fire under a canopy of stars, he thought about how differently people viewed the same situation. To him, camping by the lake was natural and peaceful. To the board, it was a challenge to their authority. He knew this would not be the last time he heard from them, but he felt confident that the truth was on his side. For Daniel, the lake was more than a feature of his property. It was a reminder of why he chose to live there, away from the rigid expectations of city life. He had worked hard to afford this retreat, and he wasn't about to give it up because others were uncomfortable. As he lay in his tent listening to the soft chorus of crickets, Daniel made a quiet promise to himself. He would protect his right to enjoy his land, no matter what obstacles appeared. The board had noticed him. The neighbors had whispered. And though the lake shimmered peacefully in the moonlight, Daniel felt the first ripples of a storm that was slowly forming. The week after Daniel's peaceful lakeside campout, a letter appeared in his mailbox. The envelope bore the association's logo, neatly printed with his name and address. He opened it on his porch, expecting perhaps a welcome note or routine update. Instead, he found a formal notice typed in sharp, commanding language. It began with cease and desist, followed by an accusation that his camping activities were in violation of community rules. The letter went on to claim that his tent, fire pit, and outdoor equipment detracted from the neighborhood aesthetic and set a precedent that could not be tolerated. At the bottom, signed in bold ink, was the name of the association president. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time. He couldn't help but smile at the formality of it. He knew the rules. He had studied them carefully before moving in, wanting to avoid any misunderstandings. Nowhere in the handbook did it say anything about camping being prohibited on private property. The closest guideline addressed recreational vehicles parked on driveways, and even that had nothing to do with what he was doing. Folding the letter neatly, Daniel placed it back in the envelope and tucked it into a folder where he kept all his important documents. If the association wanted to challenge him, he would be ready. For now, he decided to ignore the notice. After all, one letter didn't carry the weight of law, and his deed was clear proof of his rights. The following weekend, Daniel returned to his lakeside spot. He pitched his tent, set out a folding chair, and prepared a simple dinner over the fire pit. The quiet air and shimmering water made it easy to forget the tension building behind the scenes. Yet as he sipped from his mug, he noticed movement near the tree line. A pair of neighbors stood at a distance, whispering as they watched him. One held a phone, pointed in his direction. Daniel gave them a polite wave, but they didn't return it. Instead, they walked away briskly. He sighed, realizing that his simple pastime had become a topic of neighborhood gossip. By Monday morning, the second letter arrived. This one was sterner, threatening fines if he continued his activities. Again, Daniel reviewed the association's handbook. No fines could be enforced for actions not clearly outlined in the bylaws. This was an overreach, plain and simple. He tucked the second letter into his growing folder, already imagining how useful it would be if things escalated further. That evening, he sat in his living room and reflected. Why did his camping bother them so much? He wasn't blasting music, leaving messes, or disturbing anyone. In fact, the only thing drawing attention was the very presence of his tent and the idea that someone dared to enjoy the lake differently than expected. Later that week, herself appeared at his front door. Daniel opened it to see her standing there, arms folded, a clipboard in hand. Her tone was polite but firm. "Daniel," she began, "we've received multiple complaints. People are uncomfortable with what you're doing by the lake. This isn't a campground, it's a neighborhood." Daniel met her gaze calmly. "I understand, but it's my property. I'm not breaking any rules, and I've been respectful of the land." Lips tightened. "The board disagrees. You could face consequences if you continue." "Consequences based on what?" Daniel asked, tilting his head. "The bylaws don't prohibit camping. I've reviewed them carefully. Would you like to see?" For a brief moment, confidence faltered. She cleared her throat and replied, "We'll take this matter under review, but I strongly advise you to stop." With that, she turned and walked briskly down the driveway, leaving Daniel at the door. He closed it behind him, shaking his head. The conversation confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. The weekend came again, and Daniel set up camp once more. He noticed more curious eyes from across the lake, and he felt the weight of disapproval pressing in. Still, he stayed. This was his retreat, his land, and his right. As the fire crackled and stars dotted the sky, Daniel knew the association wasn't finished. The letters, the visits, the watchful eyes, this was only the beginning. The storm was building, and soon it would break. By the third weekend, Daniel had developed a quiet routine at his lakeside camp. He would arrive in the late afternoon with a small cooler, a book, and his folding chair. After pitching his tent, he would gather wood for the fire pit, then sit back and enjoy the stillness of the lake. What was meant to be his private retreat, however, was quickly becoming a source of growing conflict. It started subtly. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down when they passed by. Some whispered while glancing at the tent. Others frowned openly. What should have been casual curiosity began to feel like a deliberate watch. Daniel noticed how frequently phones were lifted toward him, as if every moment of his camping was being documented. The association's next move came on a Saturday evening. Daniel had just finished grilling a simple meal when 3 board members approached from the edge of the property. They stood with arms crossed, their expressions stiff, and one of them held a clipboard. Daniel, the man with the clipboard, called out, "We need to talk." Daniel set down his plate and walked over, calm but alert. "What's the issue now?" "You've ignored our warnings," another board member said. Your tent, your fire pit, all of this, it violates the standards of our neighborhood. You're disrupting the community." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I'm on my own land. I'm not breaking any bylaws, you know that." One of the women stepped forward. "That may be true on paper, but you're setting a dangerous precedent. If everyone starts doing this, the entire area will lose its character." Daniel held his ground. "I respect this community, but respecting it doesn't mean I give up my rights. I've reviewed the bylaws carefully. There's no rule against camping on private property. Unless you can show me otherwise, I'll continue." The exchange grew tense. The board members muttered among themselves, clearly frustrated that Daniel wasn't bending. Eventually, they left, but not before issuing a thinly veiled threat. "If you won't listen to us," one of them said, "you'll have to face the consequences." Daniel returned to his campfire, unsettled but not intimidated. Their words made it clear that this was no longer about rules. It was about power and control. The board was determined to push him into compliance, even if they had to invent authority where none existed. The next morning, Daniel awoke to find small notices taped to his mailbox and fence posts. Each one was printed with bold letters declaring unauthorized use of property. The papers carried no legal weight, but their presence was meant to send a message. Neighbors walking by gave him cautious glances, as if siding with the board or at least choosing to avoid conflict. Rather than tear the notices down in anger, Daniel carefully removed each one, folded them, and placed them into his growing folder of evidence. He understood that patience and documentation would serve him better than confrontation. Later that day, while walking along his property line, Daniel noticed something else. Association signs had been placed closer to his lakefront than before. A freshly installed post marked "Community Walking Trail" now stood just a few feet from where his tent usually rested. The placement was suspiciously bold, almost daring him to challenge it. Daniel knelt to inspect the ground around the post. The soil was freshly disturbed, the work clearly recent. He realized the board wasn't just trying to pressure him, they were beginning to encroach on his land to strengthen their claim. That evening he sat on his porch with a notepad, outlining every detail: the letters, the visits, the threats, the notices, and now the encroaching signs. He knew this pattern couldn't continue without a breaking point. The question was how far the board was willing to go to assert authority that wasn't theirs. The answer came sooner than he expected. On his next camping night, Daniel saw headlights at the far end of his property. 2 cars pulled up, and several board members stepped out, their phones ready to capture what they called evidence. They began shouting across the lake, accusing him of being reckless and demanding he leave the tent site immediately. Daniel stood by his campfire, his voice steady but firm. "This is my land. You're the ones trespassing." The board members didn't back down. One of them called out, "We'll take this to the police. Let's see if they believe you own this lake." As the shouting echoed across the water, Daniel realized the conflict was about to enter a new stage. What had started as whispers and letters had now turned into open confrontation. The board was no longer satisfied with intimidation alone. They wanted enforcement. For Daniel, this was no longer just about enjoying his weekends by the lake. It was about standing up for the principle that property rights could not be erased by pressure or tradition. As the board members finally retreated, still muttering threats, Daniel sat back down by the fire and let the sparks drift into the night sky. The storm he had sensed was indeed approaching, and when it broke, it would no longer be whispers or notices. It would be flashing lights. The following weekend, Daniel returned to his lakeside retreat with a quiet determination. The confrontations from the board still echoed in his mind, but he refused to let them drive him away. He carried his tent and gear down to the shore, set everything up neatly, and built a careful fire in the pit he had ringed with stones. As the evening air cooled, he leaned back in his chair, a book in hand, while the sky turned shades of pink and orange. For a few hours, it felt almost normal again. The lake reflected the stars as they appeared one by one, and the sound of frogs croaking in the reeds mixed with the crackle of his fire. But just as Daniel settled deeper into the calm, he noticed lights approaching at the edge of his property. At first, he thought it was the board again with their phones and clipboards. Then he saw the red and blue flashes bouncing against the trees. 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop near the gravel lane. Doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel stood from his chair, brushing the dust from his jeans, and waited as they made their way toward him. "Evening," one officer said, his tone professional but firm. "We received a complaint about illegal camping on community property." Daniel raised his eyebrows but kept his voice steady. "This isn't community property. This is my land. I own the shoreline and the lake. I can show you my deed if you'd like." The officers exchanged a glance. They weren't hostile, but they weren't entirely convinced either. "The complaint came from the homeowners association," the second officer explained. "They said you've been warned already and refused to stop." Daniel nodded, unsurprised. "They did send me letters, but none of them have any legal basis. I've reviewed the bylaws, and there's nothing prohibiting what I'm doing. More importantly, my property boundaries extend through this lakefront. I have all the documentation." He walked calmly to his tent, pulled out the folder he had been keeping, and handed it over. Inside were copies of the letters, the association handbook, and most importantly, his deed and a detailed map of the property lines. The officers took the documents and stepped back, scanning the pages with their flashlights. For several minutes, the only sounds were the chirping insects and the occasional crackle of the fire. Finally, one officer nodded slowly. "This looks legitimate. Your deed clearly includes the lakefront, and there's no mention in the handbook about camping restrictions." Before Daniel could reply, a car pulled up behind the patrol vehicles. The headlights switched off and stepped out, her clipboard clutched tightly under her arm. Her expression carried the same determination Daniel had seen before, but now it was sharpened with urgency. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said briskly, striding forward. "This man has been disrupting the community with his reckless camping. The lake has always been for everyone, and he has no right to claim it." Daniel remained calm. "This is my land. I've told you before. You can't rewrite the deed with your clipboard." The officers held up a hand, signaling for silence. One of them spoke firmly. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the documents. It appears that Mr. Daniels," he glanced at the papers, "does indeed own this land, including the portion of the lake in question." His face tightened. "That may be what the paperwork says, but for years this lake has been treated as community property. You can't just let one man change that." The officer sighed. "We're here to enforce the law, not traditions. Property boundaries are clear. Unless there's evidence of a crime, there's nothing we can do against him." Daniel watched as confidence wavered, though she quickly masked it with indignation. "So he can just camp out here whenever he pleases, build fires, invite whoever he wants. As long as he follows fire safety regulations and respects noise ordinances," the officer replied. "Then yes, it's his property." Opened her mouth to argue again, but stopped when she noticed both officers staring at her expectantly. Their patience was thinning. She muttered something under her breath, then turned on her heel and stalked back toward her car. The officers handed Daniel back his documents. "We'd suggest keeping these with you in case this happens again," one said kindly. "You're within your rights, but the association seems determined to push the issue. Document everything." "I already have," Daniel replied with a small smile. "Thank you for taking the time to look at the facts." As the patrol cars pulled away, Daniel sat back by his fire, the tension still lingering in the air. He knew wouldn't let this go. The confrontation tonight had only scratched the surface. The board had failed to remove him through warnings and intimidation, and now their attempt with law enforcement had backfired. Daniel looked out across the lake, its dark waters reflecting the last traces of red and blue light as the patrol cars disappeared into the distance. He sensed that what had just happened was not the end, but rather the beginning of a larger battle. The association had tried to paint him as the trespasser, yet the night had revealed a truth even they couldn't ignore. And soon, that truth would turn everything against them. The night after the police visit, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his folder spread wide open. Every document he had collected was laid out in neat rows. The letters from the board, the notices taped to his fence, the property handbook, and most importantly, the deed and survey maps. He traced the lines of the map with his finger, following the property boundaries that curved around the lake. It was all there in black and white. No matter how loudly the board argued, the facts would not change. He knew wouldn't give up. The encounter with the police had rattled her, but it hadn't ended her campaign. She was too invested in the idea that the lake belonged to the community. The next challenge, Daniel suspected, would be louder and more public. His prediction proved correct just a few days later. On a warm evening, Daniel returned from work to find and two other board members waiting at the edge of his driveway. Each carried a folder, and their expressions carried the same rigidity as soldiers on a mission. Daniel began, "We need to clear up what happened with the police. You may have presented documents, but the board still disputes your claim to the lakefront." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Disputes it based on what?" "Based on decades of community use," said sharply. "The lake has always been for everyone. Property lines can be complicated, and there may have been an error. We're considering involving the county to investigate." Daniel remained calm. "I welcome that. In fact, I encourage it, because when they pull the records, they'll find the same thing the officers saw. The deed is clear. I own this shoreline, and the lake itself falls within my property lines." With that, he went inside, retrieved his folder, and returned with the deed and map. He unfolded them on the hood of his truck so that all three board members could see. "Here," Daniel said, pointing to the boundary lines. "This survey was conducted when I purchased the property. You'll notice that the boundaries extend into the water. The shoreline, the trail you've marked as public, even a portion of the dock, it's all mine." The other two board members leaned in, their eyes scanning the map. One of them frowned, shifting uncomfortably. However, refused to look directly at the papers. Instead, she crossed her arms and said, "Paperwork can be misleading. Just because something is written doesn't mean it's absolute." Daniel couldn't help but chuckle. "This isn't a suggestion. It's the official deed, signed and recorded with the county. If you want to challenge it, you'll have to do so legally. But I think you already know how that will end." For the first time, the certainty in his voice wavered. She glanced at her fellow board members, who exchanged nervous looks. They were beginning to realize the strength of Daniel's position. "Even if this is true," pressed on, her tone sharpening, "you're still creating conflict by treating the lake as your personal space. That's not in the spirit of community living." Daniel folded the papers back into his folder. "The spirit of community doesn't override the law. I'm not preventing anyone from enjoying the lake as long as they respect my property. But I won't tolerate being harassed on my own land." The silence that followed was heavy. The board members had come expecting to corner him, to challenge his claims until he backed down. Instead, they were the ones facing facts they couldn't dispute. Finally broke the silence. "We'll see what the county says," she muttered, turning away. The others followed, though their steps were slower, their confidence shaken. That night, Daniel sat on his porch and watched the reflection of the moon ripple across the lake. He felt a quiet satisfaction, but also a deeper unease. The board's stubbornness wasn't about misunderstanding, it was about control. Even when faced with undeniable evidence, refused to yield. The next day, Daniel received yet another letter, this one typed in bold and underlined text. It accused him of misrepresenting property boundaries and warned that further action would be taken. He added it to his folder, shaking his head. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were accusing him of deception while ignoring the very documents that proved their own overreach. But the pressure wasn't over. Neighbors continued to watch him with wary eyes, influenced by the board's narrative. Some avoided speaking to him altogether, while others offered awkward, half-hearted greetings. Daniel knew that was spinning the situation as a battle for the neighborhood's integrity. What she didn't realize, however, was that her persistence was about to expose something far worse than a man camping on his land. The police had only seen part of the picture. Soon, the full truth about the board's actions would come to light. As Daniel prepared his tent for another weekend by the lake, he felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The board had forced the issue into the open, and now every step they took brought them closer to revealing just how far they had overstepped. The deed was clear, the land was his, and soon everyone would know it. The following week passed in tense quiet. Daniel kept to himself, spending evenings by the water and days at work, while the board remained unusually silent. He suspected they were plotting their next move. His suspicions were confirmed one Friday afternoon when 2 patrol cars once again rolled down the gravel lane leading to his property. This time, the officers weren't alone. A county surveyor stepped out of a third vehicle, carrying a large rolled-up map case under his arm. Behind them, his car appeared, followed closely by 2 other board members. They all gathered near the edge of the lake where Daniel had just set up his tent. Daniel stood calmly, arms folded, waiting for them to speak first. "Mr. Daniels," one officer said, his tone professional, "the association has asked us to review property lines in detail. They believe there may be a dispute. The county surveyor is here to clarify." Daniel nodded and gestured toward the water. "I welcome that. I've been asking for clarity from the start. Let's review the records." The surveyor unrolled his large map on the hood of his truck and placed weighted clips at each corner to hold it down against the breeze. He then pulled out a metal measuring rod and began walking the property lines. The group followed closely, tension hanging heavy in the air. As the surveyor moved along the markers, he nodded thoughtfully. "Everything here matches the deed records filed with the county. The boundary line clearly extends past the shoreline. This portion of the lake is private property belonging to Mr. Daniels." Daniel gave a small, satisfied smile, but he remained silent. He knew more was coming. The surveyor then turned his attention to the community walking trail sign recently installed. He measured its position, checked the map, and frowned. "This sign is not on association property. It's on Mr. Daniels' lot, about 12 feet inside his boundary line." The officers exchanged looks. One raised his eyebrows as if to say, "Here we go." His face turned pale, though she tried to mask it with indignation. "That trail has been used for years. People walk their dogs there, children play there. It's always been part of the community." The surveyor shook his head. "Tradition doesn't override the law. Legally, this is private land. The placement of this sign is trespassing." Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady but edged with firmness. "That's what I've been saying from the beginning. Not only am I within my rights to camp here, but the association has been trespassing on my land for years. You've built a trail, installed signs, and encouraged people to use an area that doesn't belong to you." The officers turned toward, their expressions neutral but firm. "Ma'am, this is serious. Encouraging residents to use private property without permission could expose the association to liability." His composure cracked. "We didn't know," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "We believed the lakefront belonged to the community." Daniel's calm response cut through the air. "You didn't believe, you assumed. And instead of checking the facts, you tried to intimidate me with letters, notices, and even police visits. If I hadn't kept records, you might have succeeded in convincing people I was in the wrong." The surveyor packed up his tools, his verdict final. "There's no dispute. The records are clear. Mr. Daniels owns this land, and the association has no claim here." The officers stepped closer, too. "At this point, the concern is Mr. Daniels camping on his property. It's the association trespassing on his land. We'll need to file a report about this incident." Daniel felt a wave of quiet vindication wash over him. The truth he had known all along was now spoken aloud by an official authority. The board's attempts to paint him as a troublemaker had collapsed under the weight of evidence. Tried one last desperate argument. If the lake belongs to him, does that mean he can stop people from using it entirely? The officer replied matter-of-factly, "Yes, if he chooses to. It's private property. Access would require his permission." The group fell silent. The 2 board members standing behind shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing the gravity of what they had done. What had started as an attempt to shame Daniel had backfired completely. As the officers finished their notes, Daniel gathered his folder once again. He looked directly at and said evenly, "This ends here. No more letters, no more signs, no more harassment. If you or the board continue to trespass, I'll pursue legal action. Didn't reply. She turned sharply and walked back toward her car, her silence louder than any words. That night, as Daniel sat by his campfire, the stars reflected across the still surface of the lake. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of true peace. The battle wasn't entirely over. He knew the board might try one last move, but the power had shifted. The truth was on his side, and now everyone knew it. The lake no longer shimmered with tension. It shimmered with victory. The weekend after the surveyor's verdict, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents whispered about the confrontation by the lake, and the once confident HOA board found themselves under an uncomfortable spotlight. Homeowners who had quietly followed their rules for years suddenly began questioning how much authority the board actually had. Daniel didn't have to say a word, the facts spoke for themselves. Yet the tension lingered. He expected the board to try damage control, and sure enough, a formal community notice appeared in mailboxes by Monday. The letter, written in careful, measured language, claimed there had been a misunderstanding regarding shared spaces, and assured residents the board was taking steps to resolve the matter. Nowhere in the message did they admit fault or acknowledge that they had been trespassing. To most neighbors, it sounded hollow. After all, the county surveyor's report was a matter of public record, and copies of it were already circulating among curious homeowners. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the water shimmer in the fading light, his neighbor walked over. She was one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood, known for her sharp memory and frank opinions. "I thought you should know," she said, lowering her voice. "Several of us are calling for a special meeting. The board has overstepped one time too many. This business with your land was the last straw." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll listen?" Smirked. "They'll have to. People are tired of being pushed around. What they did to you only proved what we've been saying for years." True to her word, a petition circulated within days. Enough signatures were gathered to force the board to hold an open meeting, one where residents could demand answers. The board reluctantly scheduled it for the following Thursday evening at the community center. When Daniel arrived that night, the room was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. He noticed more than a few neighbors nod in his direction, a silent gesture of support. The board members sat stiffly at a long table in the front, papers neatly stacked before them. Wearing her usual polished smile, tapped the microphone and called the meeting to order. "We'd like to begin by addressing the recent concerns about the lake," she started, her voice carefully even. "Our intention was always to protect community spaces and ensure fair use. We regret any confusion." "Confusion?" someone interrupted from the back. "You tried to get a man arrested on his own land. That's not confusion, that's abuse of power." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Smile faltered. Another resident stood. "The county surveyor proved you were wrong. Instead of apologizing, you issued a letter that dodged responsibility. Why should we trust this board to manage anything if you can't admit a mistake?" The board members exchanged nervous glances. Daniel remained quiet, listening as the frustration he had felt for weeks now echoed through the voices of his neighbors. Finally rose from her chair. "I move that this board step down, effective immediately. It's time for new leadership, people who respect property rights and treat residents with fairness instead of intimidation." The room erupted in applause. Some clapped hesitantly, others with full force, but the momentum was undeniable. "Tried to regain control. That's not how this works," she insisted. "There's a process." A resident near the front countered sharply. "Then we'll follow the process. Consider this the beginning of a recall vote, and we'll make sure everyone has the facts before they cast their ballots." The meeting ended in chaos. Residents lingered afterward, forming clusters of conversation, while the board slipped quietly out the side door. Daniel stayed behind, answering questions, showing anyone who asked the copies of his deed and the surveyor's report. By the time he left, he knew one thing for certain: the board's grip on power was slipping fast. That night, Daniel returned to his lakeside campfire. The flames crackled against the cool breeze and the reflection of the stars shimmered on the water. For the first time, he felt not just relief, but something stronger, vindication. He hadn't fought this battle only for himself. Unknowingly, he had given his neighbors the courage to challenge the board too. The HOA had tried to make an example out of him. Instead, they had become the example, the cautionary tale of what happens when authority is misused. And while the board scrambled to protect themselves, Daniel knew the final chapter hadn't been written yet. The recall effort was just beginning, and soon, the same community that had once watched silently from the sidelines would decide the board's fate. For now, though, Daniel leaned back, hands behind his head, and listened to the night sounds around the lake. The place that had nearly been taken from him was still his, and always would be. The weeks following the heated community meeting felt like a turning point. For the first time in years, residents weren't whispering about the HOA board behind closed doors. They were openly challenging its decisions. Flyers circulated about the recall vote. Small groups gathered in driveways to talk strategy, and neighbors who rarely spoke to one another suddenly shared stories about letters, fines, and pressures they had endured. Daniel, though not seeking the spotlight, inevitably became a symbol of resistance. Neighbors stopped by his property to thank him, some bringing cookies or coffee as tokens of support. "You stood up when no one else would," one father said, balancing his toddler on his hip. "You gave the rest of us courage." Daniel accepted the gratitude with humility. "I only wanted to enjoy my land," he replied, "but I'm glad the truth is out there." Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled to defend its position. They sent out carefully worded emails, reminding residents of the important role the association played in maintaining order and protecting property values. But the words rang hollow against the growing frustration. When the recall vote finally arrived, the turnout was higher than anyone expected. Neighbors filled the community center once again, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Ballots were distributed, collected, and tallied while everyone waited in tense silence. The results were decisive. A majority voted to remove, and 2 other board members immediately. Gasps echoed through the room, followed quickly by applause and cheers. The remaining board members, stunned by the outcome, announced they would appoint interim replacements until a formal election could be held. For it was a crushing blow. She left the building without addressing the residents, her once commanding presence reduced to silence. The others followed her out, their positions stripped away by the very people they had once controlled. Daniel stayed in the back of the room, quietly observing. He hadn't asked for any of this, not the spotlight, not the role of unintentional leader. But he knew he had played a part in it. The recall wasn't just about him. It was about a community that had grown tired of being managed with intimidation rather than respect. In the weeks that followed, change came quickly. A new interim board made up of long-time residents pledged to focus on fairness and transparency. They began reviewing past complaints, revering unnecessary fines, and holding open meetings where residents could actually speak without fear of being dismissed. The mood in the neighborhood shifted from tension to cautious optimism. Daniel, for his part, returned to what he had wanted all along, peace by the lake. He still camped there on weekends, sometimes inviting neighbors to join him around the fire. Families brought marshmallows, kids played near the water, and for the first time the lake felt like a place of genuine community rather than a... One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water gold, sat beside Daniel at the fire. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood your ground. They wanted to make you the villain, but instead you became the turning point." Daniel chuckled softly. "I'm no hero. I just didn't want to be bullied off my own land." Smiled, "That's exactly why it mattered, because you refused to back down." The two sat in comfortable silence, listening to the quiet lapping of the lake against the shore. For Daniel, it was more than just vindication. It was a reminder that standing firm in the face of pressure could ripple out further than he ever expected. As the stars emerged overhead, Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the fire and the calm certainty that the struggle was finally behind him. The HOA had tried to turn him into an example of disobedience. Instead, they had become the example themselves of what happens when authority forgets the limits of its power. The lake stretched before him, calm and endless, belonging fully to him once more. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself a smile, not of triumph, but of peace. The fight was over, and he had won it not just for himself, but for everyone who called the neighborhood home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.